we have challenges here in the United States. We take seriously our responsibility to address these shortcomings, and we know that the way to do it matters. Together with citizens and communities, out in the open, transparently, not trying to pretend problems don't exist or sweeping them under a rug. And in fact, that's what distinguishes democracies. Our willingness, our commitment to pursue that more perfect union. And practicing what we preach at home gives us greater legitimacy when we encourage governments abroad to do the same thing. The report also shows that the United States is concerned not only with civil and political rights, but also economic, social, cultural rights. That means, for example, affirming that promoting access to education and health services, including for reproductive health, is just as critical to advancing human rights as defending freedom of expression and assembly. These interconnected rights are critical to ensuring individuals can reach their full potential, and they're critical to sustaining healthy democracies. So with that context, let me highlight some of the most alarming findings of the report, which I want to emphasize covers the events of 2021. Governments are growing more brazen in reaching across borders to threaten and attack critics. To give just a few examples, over the last year alone, Iranian intelligence agents plotted to kidnap an Iranian-American journalist from her home in Brooklyn. The Assad regime threatened Syrians who were cooperating with efforts in Germany's courts to prosecute former officials for atrocities. The Lukashenko regime in Belarus forcibly diverted an international commercial flight to arrest an independent journalist. Governments are locking up more critics at home. Today, more than 1 million political prisoners are being held in over 65 countries. They include more than 600 people unjustly imprisoned in Cuba for taking part in peaceful protests last July. Countless Russian anti-corruption activists and opposition leaders, including Alexei Navalny, opposition presidential candidates in Benin, and Egyptian advocates like human rights lawyer Mohammed al-Bakr. We've also seen a rise in governments arbitrarily detaining individuals to try to gain leverage in bilateral relationships, to use them as human pawns. The Chinese government continues to commit genocide and crimes against humanity in Xinjiang against predominantly Muslim Uyghurs, among other minority groups, to erode fundamental freedoms and autonomy in Hong Kong, and to carry out systematic repression in Tibet. In Afghanistan, the Taliban's takeover precipitated a humanitarian crisis and has resulted in a serious erosion of human rights, from arbitrary detentions of women, protesters and journalists, to reprisals against security forces from the former government, to growing restrictions on where women and girls can study or work. In Ethiopia, all parties to the country's conflict, as well as Eritrean forces, have committed atrocities, and thousands of Ethiopians are being unjustly detained in life-threatening conditions. We invest so much effort into documenting these and other abuses year after year, not only because it aligns our most sacred values, but also because respect for human rights is a fundamental part of upholding the international rules-based order, which is crucial to America's enduring security and prosperity. Governments that violate human rights are almost always the same ones that flout other key parts of that order, just as such as invading, coercing, or threatening trade rules. Threatening other countries or breaking trade rules. So our interest in standing up for human rights isn't only principled, it is vital to our national security. Here are some of the other ways that we're working to support human rights. When senior members of the State Department travel abroad, we meet with human rights advocates, with journalists and other frontline defenders, as do our ambassadors at every post, even when foreign governments make it clear that they wish we would not. We work with the Treasury Department to apply sanctions and impose visa restrictions on human rights abusers and those who enable and profit from them through the Global Magnitsky Act, the Khashoggi ban, and other tools. We methodically collect, preserve, and analyze evidence of atrocities and make this information available to the appropriate bodies. Indeed, it was the department's rigorous documentation, which included our own fact-finding and reports by a range of independent, impartial sources, including human rights organizations, that provided a basis for my determination last month that Burma's military committed genocide and crimes against humanity against Rohingya. We work with business to foster greater respect for human rights, both by encouraging compliance with labor standards and discouraging exports to governments and other entities that may use those goods or services to commit abuses. We're fully engaged in multilateral institutions, even flawed ones. After regaining a seat on the UN Human Rights Council, we just led a successful effort to suspend Russia from that body, because a country that's perpetrating gross and systematic violations of human rights shouldn't sit on a body whose job it is to protect those rights. And we're working to strengthen democracy, human rights, and the fight against corruption through the Summit for Democracy. Last December, President Biden convened 100 world leaders, as well as representatives from civil society and the private sector, for the first summit. That kicked off a year of action that we're in the midst of pursuing. We're focused on delivering progress, not just pronouncements, by encouraging countries to make concrete commitments to advance human rights and democracy. And we're holding one another to our pledges. Before turning to questions, let me just thank everyone who's had a hand in producing this report. This is an enterprise that cuts across the entire State Department. We have local staff and career officers in posts around the world, as well as here in Washington, whose determination and rigor are shining a bright light on these issues every single day. And the brave human rights defenders, journalists, and others documenting those abuses from up close, frequently at grave risk to themselves and their loved ones. This is your report too, and we thank you for it. So we're approaching the 15-month mark since this administration took office. We still don't have a confirmed Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Outstanding career officers have stepped up to lead a devoted DRL team that carries this mission forward. And I want to thank you, Lisa, in particular, for exceptional service and stewardship in this time. But for the United States to be the best possible advocate of human rights and democracy worldwide, we need a Senate-confirmed Assistant Secretary. We have a highly qualified nominee for this position, Sarah Margon. I urge the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to allow her nomination to move forward soon. With that, happy to start taking some questions, and then I'll turn it over to Lisa.
Missy.
Secretary Blinken, could you talk about how you think about the tension between the desire to elevate human rights as part of American foreign policy and the desire to halt this recession that you mentioned, with the need to shore up alliances that are seen as crucial to American interests with some countries that have problematic human rights records? I'm thinking of Egypt and its relationship with the Palestinian authorities, or Saudi Arabia and its oil supplies. How do you think about that tension, and how do you respond to the criticism that the United States is implicitly condoning abuses by those governments?
So this is not a new tension. In some ways, it's an age-old one, and administrations that in the past and now ours that are putting human rights and democracy front and center in their foreign policy have to confront it, and we work through it every single day. It's different from country to country, partner to partner, circumstance to circumstance. But I think what we're doing is to just be very forthright in what we stand for, what we look for, and we try to work with countries to make progress. And again, this varies from place to place, but we're not holding back in what we're saying. We're not holding back in what we're trying to do, but we also are looking carefully to determine how we think we can be most effective in advancing the ball, and whether that is focusing in public on some of the concerns, shortcomings, problems that we're seeing, whether that's pushing people in private. We have to make that judgment in each and every case. Having said that, this report, a public report, is very clear about the issues, challenges, concerns we have across the world with nearly 200 countries. And as I said before, it doesn't distinguish between friend and foe. We apply the same standard everywhere. We do it publicly, as in this report. We do it publicly often when I have an opportunity to speak, including in the countries that we're visiting where we have concerns. But again, part of this is making determinations on how we think we can be most effective. And in most cases, this is a process. It's not flipping a switch. We don't expect that things will change from one day to the other. It's the result of sustained engagement and trying to move partners along. Finally, I just say that I think we have, in a way, added credibility precisely because when it comes to our own shortcomings at home, we're not dodging them, we're not ignoring them, we're not denying them. We're confronting them directly, and in so doing, we strengthen our position, we strengthen our voice in advancing rights. But again, this is a process. It's not something that happens from one day to the next. We're engaged in it. Let's see where we are over the coming years and the progress that we make in individual places.
Francesca.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. You were mentioning the situation in Ukraine. Have you made an assessment of any alleged use of chemical agents or weapons in Ukraine? And how credible would you say the reports coming from the Mariupol era are? Or do you have any intelligence about any imminent use of chemical weapons?
So when it comes to the reports you're referring to, we're not in a position to confirm anything. I don't think the Ukrainians are either. But let me say this. We had credible information that Russian forces may use a variety of riot control agents, including tear gas, mixed with chemical agents that would cause stronger symptoms, to weaken and incapacitate entrenched Ukrainian fighters and civilians as part of the aggressive campaign to take Mariupol. We shared that information with Ukraine as well as with other partners, and we're in direct conversation with partners to try to determine what actually has happened. So this is a real concern. It's a concern that we had from before the aggression started. I think I pointed to the possibility that these kinds of weapons would be used, and it's something that we're very, very focused on.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
All right, Lisa, over to you. Thanks, folks. See you later.
Can you speak about Russia more
Thank you.
specifically in the opposition?
Thanks, Andrea.
It's a privilege to be here for the release of the 46th Human Rights Report, which we submitted to the U.S. Congress earlier today. For nearly 5 decades, the United States has issued the country reports on human rights practices, addressing the status of internationally recognized human rights in all countries that are members of the United Nations. The annual Human Rights Report includes 198 reports on individual countries and territories and provides an objective record of whether and how human rights and fundamental freedoms are protected by law and in practice around the world. The individual reports draw on information from a range of governmental, non-governmental, and media sources. The Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, which I currently lead, is at the forefront of preparing these reports, along with colleagues across the department and our embassies in the field. And I'm proud to note that this June we will mark our 45th anniversary. In 1977, the Carter administration oversaw the establishment of what is now the DRL Bureau, with the mission of advancing individual liberty and democratic freedoms around the world and upholding the truth enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that all individuals are born equal in dignity and rights. Over those 4.5 decades, DRL has rolled up our sleeves alongside U.S. government colleagues, as well as countless brave human rights defenders and other civil society leaders, to promote our namesake values of democracy, human rights, and labor. Despite innumerable achievements over that period to defend and strengthen democracy and to promote and protect human rights and labor rights, serious challenges persist. Some of today's challenges to democracy and human rights are long-standing and familiar. Others are new and evolving. All demand continued leadership from the United States in close collaboration with our partners and allies across the globe. On the home front, strengthening our democracy in the United States and ensuring that the fundamental freedoms and human rights of all people are protected and advanced is a critical part of the Biden-Harris administration's commitment to global leadership on human rights. We can't be credible advocates for human rights abroad if we don't live up to the same principles at home. We do not claim a moral high ground, but we do, in the words of our Constitution, resolve to form a more perfect union, which means we must continue to address the many human rights challenges in our own country. The Summit for Democracy, held this past December, served as a rallying point to address these challenges, both new and old. President Biden brought together world leaders, civil society, and private sector representatives in a shared commitment to push back against authoritarianism, fight corruption, and advance respect for human rights. We're taking forward the momentum of the first summit through a year of action in which governments, including the United States, are working to fulfill our commitments and tackle human rights challenges at home and globally, in partnership with civil society. The yearly Human Rights Report speaks to the importance that we place on these goals. The report does not attempt to catalog every human rights-related incident. It is not an effort by the U.S. government to judge others. It does not reach legal conclusions, rank countries, or draw comparisons. We've seen all too well in recent years that around the world, democracy and human rights have been threatened and undermined by disinformation, misinformation, and outright lies. So our objective with the Human Rights Report is simple: bring the facts to the table. It is only when we're armed with the truth that the United States can most effectively use our voice and our influence to call attention to violations and abuses of human rights worldwide, and press the perpetrators of these violations and abuses to change course and end their egregious conduct. At the conclusion of this press briefing, the 2021 Human Rights Report will be available to the public on the State Department website at www.state.gov. Thank you for being here today, and with that, I'm happy to take your questions.
Yes.
Hello, Gita Aryan, Voice of America Persian Service. The Secretary just mentioned Iran as one of the examples of countries where human rights violation is rampant, and he referred to abduction or attempt to abduct dissidents overseas. A little over a year ago, the Secretary also issued a statement designating a number of IRGC commanders for having a hand in the arrest, imprisonment, and torture of protesters a couple of years ago. And in continuation of that statement, the Secretary said that the U.S. will continue to support the Iranian people. Now, how has the Biden administration helped or supported the Iranian people during this past year, given that the list of violations of human rights on Iran in the report is, I don't know, 10, 15 lines long?
So we continue to find ways, both in public and in very discreet manners, to support people who are trying to advance the human rights situation in Iran. As you note, we have also put into play a variety of sanctions tools. I am sorry, I don't have details in front of me at this moment, but it is something that I would be happy to circle back to you on.
Johnny.
Thank you. On the North Korean human rights issues, human rights violations are currently ongoing in North Korea. And North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is massacred their own citizens. What is the final destination for the United States to resolve the North Korean human rights problem?
So we do recognize that the DPRK is among the most repressive authoritarian states in the world, and obviously we remain deeply concerned about reports of systemic, widespread, and gross human rights violations and abuses committed by the DPRK government, and we certainly hope that one day justice may be achieved for the people of North Korea. similar to the very difficult operating circumstances with Iran, we continue to work with the international community to raise awareness, document and preserve information on human rights abuses and violations, and increase access to independent information. We also seek to impose sanctions on those who are complicit in abuses and violations, and as always, promote respect for human rights within the DPRK.
Do you have any tools used for the resolve these human rights issues in North Korea, or you don't have anything because this is a long time being the North Koreans human rights abuse the human rights issue?
Obviously, that is an extremely difficult environment to be able to influence, but it is an area that we continue to focus our efforts on to try to raise awareness around the issues within North Korea.
Yes.
How do you assess the human rights record in the Middle East? Are they deteriorated, or how do you see them?
I would hesitate to speak to the Middle East as a region as a whole. Each country has its individual circumstances. Some have progress, some less so. So I would hesitate to speak on an entire region.
On Russia, the report obviously covers the 2021 period, but Russia seems to be committing even worse atrocities this year in Ukraine and its repression at home. I would wonder if you would agree with that characterization, and then secondly, if you could expand on why that would be the case. Do you think that Vladimir Putin has a sense of impunity because he hasn't faced repercussions in the past?
So I will share that, because the report does focus on 2021 and a lot of the preparation is very focused on what went into those reports, I was struck by the manner in which the listing of issues with Russia have simply been amplified in the context of the Russia-Ukraine context. As to why that has happened, I will not speculate on what is motivating Putin.
Sir.
Thank you. In Georgia, there are some serious concerns about Georgia's human rights record. Many believe within the country, and my respondents here in DC, former diplomats, that Georgia is leaning towards illiberalism. Secretary Blinken mentioned that it's irrespective to friends or not friendly countries. That applies. That human rights standard applies equally to everyone. I just want to gather your thoughts. How far is the United States willing to go further if the former partners, and Georgia has been partnering with the US for the last 30 years, is violating systematically human rights within its territory? Thank you.
So clearly we do have a list of human rights concerns with Georgia. I will also note that we have been following actions such as the October elections. And while those were characterized as candidates generally being able to campaign freely, but there were observations from OSCE observers that the competitive environment was marred by widespread and consistent allegations of intimidation. I do think that this is an appropriate example of how we do see problems in countries, and we use the human rights reports to analyze and understand those problems. But in understanding and analyzing, we try to find ways to move forward. And as long as there is opportunity for engagement with a government, we will continue to engage on those human rights issues.
Hi, thank you. I know that the report covers last year, but I just wanted to ask you something a little bit more contemporary. There has been a lot of reporting, an increase in reporting of accounts of rape and sexual violence from Ukraine. UN human rights monitors are seeking to verify these allegations of sexual violence by Russian forces. Is that something the United States is picking up? And do you think that it has reached a level where rape is used as a weapon of war?
So the reports of sexual violence are certainly something that we are tracking both in our own efforts to understand what is happening in Ukraine, in our own efforts to catalog what is happening there, and through the various citizen-level mechanisms and multilateral approaches that are all gathering information. We are hearing horrific stories. I'm sure you are hearing horrific stories as well, and that is something that we will continue to gather and ultimately, ideally, have it feed into transitional justice mechanisms.
Following up a bit on that as well, sorry to bring it back to Ukraine, there's also been a claim by the Ukraine's UN ambassador that Russia has taken more than 121,000 children out of Ukraine and is reportedly drafting a bill to simplify and accelerate adoption procedures for orphans. This is something obviously coming from the Ukrainian side. Is this something that the US is also tracking and looking into in terms of the kind of behavior that is being reported by the Ukrainians?
This is certainly something that we have heard about. This is something that we will continue to try to learn more about and try to determine what action may be possible.
Final question? Yes.
Yes. These reports every year include a lot of details about LGBTQ rights abroad, and I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about folks who might be critical of that in the context of what's happening here in the United States with bills like the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, efforts to discriminate against transgender folks, et cetera. Any thoughts on that point?
So, this will not be the first issue on which people will say, well, what about your own country? I do think, again, within the framing of the Summit for Democracy and the approach that this administration has taken, we're not trying to pretend that these are not issues that we are grappling with here in the United States. This report, because it is very clearly focused on the rest of the world, we do dig in on other countries. We do not have a mandate to do a report on our own circumstances.
Final question, Andrea.
Any comment on Russia's arrest of Kara-Murza just hours after he appeared on 2 American networks from Moscow speaking out against the Russian war?
I would speak in general about Russia's further crackdown on freedom of information, freedom of expression in Russia in the context of the Ukraine conflict. This was space that they were closing even before the conflict started. Their efforts to close down that space have simply grown exponentially since the start of the conflict, and we would want to see that space reopened so that Russians can understand what is happening within their neighborhood and what their government is doing.
Thank you very much. See you next year, if not sooner.
See you.
Yes. Hopefully sooner. Let me actually start where you left off, Andrea, and to go back to a point that Connor raised. And with the arrest of Vladimir Kara-Murza, to add a little more detail to this, this is someone who has previously endured arrests and even near-fatal poisonings in connection with nothing more than his peaceful activities on behalf of the human rights and civil liberties of the Russian people. We've urged Russia to cease the abuse of repressive laws that it has used to target its own citizens, nonviolent demonstrators, peaceful protesters, individuals who are doing nothing more than advocating, again, peacefully on behalf of what are rights that are as universal to them as they are to people around the world. The Russian people, and this is the key point, like people everywhere, have the right to speak freely, to form peaceful associations, to exercise their freedom of expression, and to have their voices heard through free and fair elections. And Connor, you asked about the trends we're seeing in Russia, and certainly anecdotally at least, we do seem to be seeing a crackdown, a regime that is more aggressive beyond its borders and more repressive within its borders. We've seen that last year. We spoke about that in the context of the arrest of Alexei Navalny, the subsequent arrest, detention of the thousands of individuals who, again, peacefully took to the streets to protest his detention. We've seen that just over the past 24 hours with the arrest of Vladimir Kara-Murza. We've seen that in recent weeks with the detention of more than 15,000 Russians who took to the streets to protest what their own government is doing purportedly in their name, and the subsequent crackdown that we've seen in towns and cities across Russia, from Moscow to St. Petersburg, Vladimir Putin's hometown, to towns and cities across the country. I think if you look at this, these are not the actions of a government that is confident. These are the actions of a government, of a regime that is fundamentally insecure, that is not willing to allow its own people to do what is the right of every people everywhere, to voice their protests, to march peacefully, to form associations, and to make their voices and their free will heard. Andrea.
In a related issue, in clear rejection of the President's appeal to President Xi, China is reportedly increasing its echo chamber of the Russian false statements about atrocities, false claims that it was Ukraine that staged a lot of these atrocities. Is there anything more between the U.S. and Beijing in trying to get them to not propagate these the propaganda from Russia?
These lies. This has been a topic between, to include at the highest levels, between the United States and the PRC. President Biden did have an opportunity to address this. Other senior officials in this government have had an opportunity to address this. The fact is, at the end of the day, the PRC is going to make their own choices about their partnerships, their alliances, their actions, and their messaging. And this would not be the first time that we have seen false propaganda emanate from the organs of the PRC. It won't be the last time. Our concern, however, is that this time is different because the issue is not the sort of run-of-the-mill propaganda that we expect to hear from governments that have something of an adversarial relationship with the truth on occasion. This is an effort that may seek to provide cover to Russia's potential plans to employ some of the most heinous weapons in their arsenal against the free people of Ukraine. We are concerned, as we've said before, that Russia may seek to resort to chemical weapons. We're concerned on the basis of a few elements. We know that Russia has a track record. Russia has used these agents against its own people on Russian soil, on European soil. Russia is engaging in the practice of projection, projecting onto, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's the United States, what they themselves may be planning to do in terms of the false lies that there are active chemical weapons programs on Ukrainian soil, or that the United States is somehow involved in any chemical weapons program on Ukrainian soil, both outright lies. And of course, we know that this is not a campaign that has gone according to plan for Vladimir Putin. And you can make that judgment on the basis of any number of facts, but at the most basic level, and we have declassified this, you've heard this from our CIA director, this was a campaign that Vladimir Putin thought would land his forces in Kyiv within 48 or 72 hours, very shortly after the initiation of aggression against Ukraine. We're now more than 5 weeks into Russia's war against Ukraine. Russia has lost the Battle of Kyiv. Its forces are retreating, and Russia's tactics are becoming even more brutal. So the Secretary was asked earlier about reports. We're not in a position to confirm anything at this time, but we've long voiced our concern, and long voiced our concern that any government would seek to lend any degree of credibility to what appear to be nothing more than outright lies, seeking to cover, obfuscate what Russia may be planning to do in terms of the employment of chemical weapons. Kyla, I'll come back.
On that, could you provide any more clarity on the U.S. role in confirming these reports? Have you guys just offered to assist in determining if these chemical weapons were used, or is there an active process underway and you guys are part of that process? Are you reviewing any evidence and the like?
So this, in some ways, started before the reports that emerged yesterday, and you heard from the Secretary just a moment ago that we had developed credible information preceding the reports that came to the fore yesterday, that Russia's forces may use a variety of riot control agents, and that includes tear gas mixed with chemical agents that would cause stronger symptoms, as part of the effort to weaken and incapacitate entrenched Ukrainian fighters and even civilians as part of its campaign to take Mariupol. We've had a dialogue with our Ukrainian partners. We shared this intelligence with them, as we have shared a great deal of intelligence and information with them, both tactical and strategic, and we shared the gist of this publicly, at least in terms of the outlines of our concerns that Russia may be seeking to use to employ chemical weapons. We already have been in direct conversations with our Ukrainian partners as they are collecting facts and evidence. We do stand ready to assist in case we can be useful in terms of that investigation, whether it is any sort of technical capability or anything else. But our Ukrainian partners know that we're standing ready.
Just one more on that. And given that your intelligence predicted that this was in the realm of possibility, can you detail any specific protective equipment or anything that the United States has provided to Ukrainians? Gas masks, protective clothing. We've heard a lot about weapons, but we haven't heard a ton about those things. Have you provided those necessities to the Ukrainians?
Yes, so we have provided material and protective equipment to our Ukrainian partners to protect them from the potential use of chemical weapons. We can get you a broader inventory of what that looked like.
And that's already there?
We've provided that to them,
okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
And just to follow up on what the Secretary said, and you just repeated, when you say you have credible informations, even if it was before the latest reports, is that recent information about this possible use of chemical
It's
agents?
recent information. It was recent information that was available to us before the reports emerged yesterday. Yes, you are.
Ned, can I just switch gears a little bit, still talk about Ukraine, but can you talk a little bit about how the United States views the potential NATO membership or replication of Sweden and Finland? This was discussed in last week's NATO summit. Can you guys outright say this is something you welcome in light of these repeated statements from Russia saying that it would lead to instability, and there are various views that might be seen as some provocation or anything like that? Can you just outline the U.S. thinking around that, please?
Sure. Well, as you know, the United States, nor any other country, nor any other ally, does not speak on behalf of NATO. This would be a decision for the alliance to make when it comes to the aspirations of any aspirant country. What I can say, and what we do support, is the principle of NATO's open door. It should be up to the members of the alliance and no other country to determine what NATO's roster looks like. If there are aspirant countries that are raising their hands that meet the stringent criteria that NATO has put forward, that would be a decision for the NATO alliance to make.
Do you anticipate that these membership applications are likely to come through because of what's been happening regarding the war in Ukraine?
I would have to refer you to any aspirant countries to speak to the status of their applications for joining the NATO alliance. But I will say this, and without speaking to any NATO allies beyond potential NATO allies beyond the 30 current NATO allies, the point that the Secretary has consistently made, that Vladimir Putin has precipitated everything he has sought to prevent, I think is showcased here. We are now 5-6 weeks into this war in Ukraine. In many ways, this is a strategic defeat for Russia already. And one of the ways it's a strategic defeat is because the international community, and NATO in particular, has never been stronger, has never been more united, has never been more purposeful since the end of the Cold War. And you can measure that in the level of consensus and unanimity that has emanated from recent sessions of the NAC, the recent foreign ministerial that took place in Brussels, but you can also measure it in some ways quantitatively in terms of the number of U.S. service members who are now in Europe. It's increased from some 60,000 to now over 100,000. To the capabilities that NATO has at its disposal, to the steps that the alliance has taken to reassure countries on NATO's eastern flank. All of this is done defensively in reaction to the offensive operations that Vladimir Putin is undertaking inside of Ukraine. None of this...
So what do you exactly make of Kremlin saying that the possible accession of Sweden and Finland would not bring stability to Europe? Is that a threat?
As a general matter, without speaking to any specific Kremlin statements, NATO is a defensive alliance. How the strengthening of a defensive alliance would bring anything other than additional stability and security, that's not something that I have a hard time imagining. Yes.
Speaking of alliances with NATO and all the work that this administration has done in the lead up to this conflict, there's a very important presidential election going on in France. How concerned is the US about the possibility of Marine Le Pen becoming the leader of a country like France, who you've obviously worked very hard with in terms of alliances against the Kremlin and displaying unity between the US and Europe?
This is a question for the people of France. France is our oldest ally, but this is a question for the French people, and they will exercise their right to vote in the coming days. Yes.
Nearly 3 weeks ago now, the administration announced that it would accept up to 100,000 Ukrainian refugees. Can you give us any update on what your plans are to actually do that?
Well, this is a question that we are working on right now with colleagues throughout the administration, including in the Department of Homeland Security. The statement that the president made from Warsaw is that the United States would seek to admit up to 100,000 Ukrainians. And so the U.S. RAP program, the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, is one potential avenue that we would seek to utilize to reach that number, but there are other programs and authorities that we could potentially use, including programs and authorities that would seek to reunite and reunify families that have been separated because of President Putin's aggression in Ukraine. But even as we work on these questions with our colleagues throughout the interagency, we are already taking drastic action to support the humanitarian needs of those who have been internally displaced inside Ukraine, and the millions who have been forced to flee their home country and who are now residing in most cases, nearby European countries. We also know that many Ukrainians want to stay in the region, and they want to stay in the region for a couple of reasons. In many cases, many of them have had to leave behind husbands, brothers, sons who are fighting this Russian aggression. Additionally, there is every hope, and we share this hope, that Ukraine will, before long, once again, be a secure, stable country where Ukrainians can return to. So our goal is in the near term to support the humanitarian needs of IDPs inside Ukraine, refugees inside Europe, and then as appropriate and given the level of demand, to welcome up to 100,000 Ukrainians to the United States using all legal pathways available.
But for those who don't want to stay in the region, they would want to come now. And so you don't have anything in place now. You're not taking action right now.
There are existing programs, including the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. There's the Lautenberg program that is very active right now. There are other potential avenues, and what the president committed to was to accelerate and to expand the scope of our ability to welcome Ukrainians to the United States should they choose to come here.
Can I ask just on another
Sure.
topic on Brittany Griner's case? Do you have any update? Have you tried to make a consular visit and been denied in the last month? And on Trevor Reed, any response to his to the denial of his appeal today, and his statement in court that he's not getting any medicine and or treatment for a broken rib?
So when it comes to Brittany Griner, you heard us confirm that an official from our embassy in Moscow had an opportunity to pay her a consular visit on March 23rd, earlier this year. We have, beyond one-off consular visits, continued to insist that Russian authorities allow consistent, timely consular access to all U.S. citizens who are detained in Russia. That includes those who are in pretrial detention, including Brittany Griner. We are in frequent contact with her legal team, with her broader network, and we have no higher priority than the safety and security of Americans, including those who are incarcerated in Russia. Similarly, with Trevor Reed, the appeals court in Moscow today denied Trevor Reed the justice he deserves by remanding his case to a lower court. As you know, Ambassador Sullivan was in the court earlier today. He was able to talk to Trevor Reed through a camera to briefly ask him about his health, which does remain a concern of ours. The point with Trevor Reed is that he remains in prison for a crime he did not commit. And Ambassador Sullivan noted this earlier today, but the evidence at his trial was so flimsy that spectators and even court personnel laughed during the proceedings. We know that Trevor's health has deteriorated. He is in the hospital in Mordovia. He has exhibited, as you heard today from Ambassador Sullivan, symptoms of tuberculosis. We do believe that he needs urgent treatment to prevent any further deterioration in his medical condition, and we appeal once again to the Russian government to provide a treatment plan and urgent medical care so that his family can be assured that his health needs are being addressed. And above and beyond that, we continue to urge that he be released, given that he is being unjustly held and should be reunited with his family. Johnny.
South Korea and Ukraine. Ukraine President Zelensky has requested WMD, weapons of mass destruction from the South Korea yesterday during he gave a speech at the South Korea's National Assembly. And the South Korean government refused to provide WMD to Ukraine. What do you think of South Korea's refusal of this request?
I'm not familiar with that specific request, but any specific request that would come from our Ukrainian partners to another government, we would have to refer to that other government. Yes, go ahead.
This is justified because this WMD is willing to provide the Ukraine, and the United States also provide the Ukraine for the WMD stuff.
What we and our partners are providing Ukraine is a massive amount of security assistance and precisely what our Ukrainian partners need to defend themselves against Russian aggression. In the case of the United States, we've provided over $2.4 billion worth of security assistance since the start of this administration, about $1.7 billion over the past month alone. If you add in contributions from our partners and allies around the world, more than 30 countries that have provided security assistance to Ukraine since the start of this aggression, that number grows even higher. And I think you can look at the effectiveness of that security assistance through a number of different lenses. As I said before, Russia has lost the Battle of Kyiv. They lost the Battle of Kyiv as a result of the determination, the tenacity, the bravery, and the grit of the Ukrainian people. But what has enabled Ukrainian resistance to this aggression is the massive amount of security assistance that the United States and our partners and allies from around the world have provided. And you can measure just the amount of that security assistance, again, through by a number of different ways. If you take, for example, anti-tank systems that are currently in Ukraine. For every Russian tank currently in Ukraine, the United States alone has provided 10 anti-tank systems. If you add in the contributions of our partners and allies, their anti-tank systems, that number and that ratio goes up to 90 anti-tank systems for every single Russian tank in Ukraine. It is a similar ratio in terms of anti-armored systems. For every Russian armored vehicle, the United States has provided 3 anti-armor systems. If you count the contributions of our partners and allies, that ratio goes up to 25 to 1. And you can go almost across the board in terms of Russian assets in Ukraine and the amount of security assistance that we have provided. What we're also doing beyond the scale and the size of that security assistance, we are providing our Ukrainian partners with precisely the type of security assistance they've requested. You heard from our colleagues yesterday that we're going to be in a position to provide artillery, and that will come as a direct result of what we've heard from our Ukrainian partners. We also announced on Friday, and our Slovak partners announced on Friday, that they would be transferring the S-300 long-range anti-aircraft system. That transfer was complemented and in some ways enabled by the fact that we were able to backfill that system with the provision of a Patriot missile battery. So whether it is equipment from our own stocks, whether it is our ability to backfill what our partners and allies are then in turn providing, or whether it is what our partners and allies themselves are providing, we are making sure that every single day there is a delivery of much needed and requested security assistance to our Ukrainian partners. And most importantly, it's security assistance that is having a clear effect on the battlefield. Yes?
Switch topic. What is your comment on the attacks in Israel and the Israeli military operation in Jenin camp?
Well, we're deeply concerned with violence in Israel and the West Bank, which we saw continue, unfortunately, over the weekend, and which has led to the deaths and injury of Israeli and Palestinian civilians. We urge all sides to refrain from actions that escalate tensions and unrest and undercut efforts to advance a two-state solution. And we encourage all sides to work together to end this cycle of violence. Yes?
Mariupol's mayor has said that more than 20,000 civilians may have been killed in that city so far. Does the State Department have a sense of the civilian casualties in terms of numbers so far in Ukraine overall? And then I have another question about Mariupol. Apparently there are people that are being forcibly removed from that city and sent into either Russian controlled areas or Russian cities throughout the country of Russia. Do you know if that's happening? Does the U.S. have any evidence of that happening right now?
So in terms of the death toll, we aren't in a position to attach a figure to that, primarily because the Battle of Mariupol continues. Violence, in some cases unimaginable levels of violence and brutality, continue to inflict grave harm on the people there. So we've heard estimates, but until we have, and our Ukrainian partners in the first instance, have a better sense of what has transpired on the ground, we're just not going to be in a position to attach a figure to that or to endorse any numbers. When it comes to reports of forced displacement, we have seen these reports. We believe some of them are credible. What we have consistently said is that whether it's Mariupol or other besieged areas, there need to be humanitarian corridors to allow people to leave on their own free will, not to see to it that the only escape hatch they have is to a place like Russia or to the North Belarus, but to areas that are not under siege. Just as civilians should be allowed to leave, humanitarian assistance should be allowed to enter, to flow in. We have not seen humanitarian corridors stick, certainly not to the extent that they should, because of one actor in this conflict, and that has been the Russian aggression, even when humanitarian corridors have been agreed upon. Missy.
Just to follow up on Humera's question earlier about Finland and Sweden, without speaking for NATO or speaking to their potential application, can you just say what the United States believes it would mean for NATO to have additional members with significant military, the kind of significant military capability that those countries have? As you know, they have a lot more military assets and bigger militaries than many other NATO countries. And if they're just, I'm just trying to get at what this would do to the deterrent or defensive power of the alliance.
It's a difficult question to answer because I know you asked me to zoom out, but I think by answering that question, I would necessarily need to zoom in on two aspirant countries or potential aspirant countries to the NATO alliance. But the point is that NATO is a defensive alliance. NATO now is more determined, more committed, more purposeful in those defensive aims precisely because we have seen Russia, NATO's neighbor to the east, take aggressive action, take offensive action against countries in the region. There's a concern, of course, that President Putin's aims may not be confined solely to Ukraine. Of course, there are pro-Russia forces in Georgia, and Russia is a country that has meddled in other places as well, certainly to include Moldova. So the reason, again, without speaking to any other countries, the reason we may be seeing additional interest in a defensive alliance is precisely because we've seen offensive operations and aggression on the part of the Russian Federation. So if there is any cause of increased interest on the NATO alliance, if there is anything that at its core undergirds this sense of purpose, of unity, of determination on the NATO alliance, at the core of that, I think it's fair to say, is Vladimir Putin. One final question? Sure.
Can I just ask something about Afghanistan? Does the U.S. have a hard number of how many American citizens are still in the country? How many of those people are trying to leave Afghanistan? And when was the last charter flight to take Americans out of the country?
So we have made a commitment, as you know, to U.S. citizens, to lawful permanent residents, to those we have a special commitment to help them relocate from Afghanistan should they choose to do so. Those efforts have been underway since the end of the U.S. military evacuation. The number is close to 1,000 between American citizens, U.S. citizens, and lawful permanent residents who have been directly relocated out of Afghanistan with the assistance of the U.S. government. When it comes to the estimate of U.S. citizens who are still in Afghanistan, that's a number, as you know, that fluctuates because there have been recent we have recently been able to affect the relocation of additional Americans out of Afghanistan, but there are Americans who will raise their hands, having seen the success we've had. So we are in touch with a number of Americans. We're continuing to do everything we can to support their desire to relocate, and we will continue to do that as long as there are Americans who wish to leave the country.
Have there been flights that have been able to get out, though, recently?
There have been recent flights.
Do you have the number of people who are in third countries still trying to get into the States? These are non-American citizens.
We can. I think we can get you those numbers.
On Shanghai and the Consul General closing, can
Sure.
you speak to the decision and particularly that it was based around the COVID restrictions? Or do you view them? China says that they're based in science. Do you view them as onerous, as severe, as a violation of folks' freedom of movement or anything like that?
Well, as you alluded to, Connor, we did yesterday order the departure of non-emergency U.S. government personnel and family members from our Consulate General in Shanghai due to two things. One, the ongoing COVID-19 outbreak in Shanghai, but also the restrictions related to the PRC's response to that outbreak. We previously were on authorized departure, and the move to ordered departure means that we are now mandating that all family members and certain employees depart Shanghai rather than making this relocation decision voluntary. This reflects at its core our assessment that it is best for our employees and their families to temporarily reduce in-country staffing as we deal with changing circumstances on the ground. There are commercial flights. We expect our employees and their family members will be able to depart Shanghai in the coming days on commercial flights. Ambassador Burns and other Department of Mission officials have consistently raised our concerns about the safety and welfare of U.S. citizens with PRC officials, including in the context of the PRC's COVID restrictions. We've informed the government of the PRC about our ordered departure. And even as we draw down our staff at the Consulate General in Shanghai, we continue to provide support to our U.S. citizen community throughout the PRC. We've adjusted staffing throughout the mission to respond to the surge in demand for emergency citizen services, including by standing up a team at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing to provide supplemental support to Consulate General Shanghai. And where conditions permit, routine U.S. citizen and visa services remain open to the public, and facilities at the U.S. Consulate General in Shanghai will reopen to the public as soon as possible.
So just to be clear, though, do you view these restrictions as too severe?
Well, we have moved from authorized departure to ordered departure because of the scale of the COVID-19 pandemic and the restrictions that have been placed by PRC authorities on people in Shanghai, including our diplomats and their families. Thank you all very much.